Hey, welcome back to the show. We've got two great topics to discuss with you today. First of all, the Somali fraud scandal, which continues to be out of control. If you want to know how bad it really is, stick around because I'm going to share some numbers with you that you won't believe. We're also going to discuss HR 3482, which is going to make it a federal crime for anybody to aid in any type of gender-affirming care. That and much more coming up right now. So let's go ahead and start with the Minnesota fraud scandal, which Tim Walz, the governor, refuses to take any responsibility for. Ilhan Omar refuses to take any responsibility for any of the fraud either. And let me tell you, she is very involved with the Somali community. As a matter of fact, she was a pioneer for some of the programs, the social programs that were the catalyst for the fraud. Let's listen to how bad this fraud scandal actually is.
Over the past few weeks, the Somali fraud story started off at around $1 billion, right? And that was bad enough. That quickly became billions. And then yesterday, that number skyrocketed. The U.S. attorney in Minnesota talking about a completely different scheme here, announcing state programs were targeted with fraud, and the state is absolutely swamped with these crimes, he says. The feds believe a significant amount of the $18 billion paid out by Medicaid to Minnesota programs was fraudulent. Prosecutors believe it could be as much as half of that $18 billion. So that's $9 billion more added to the already billions we've seen. Added up, you're getting close to potentially $20 billion in potential fraud, a huge sum of that, much of that stolen by Somalian refugees, people who begged for their lives to be allowed into your country and then thanked you by stealing a tremendous amount of money. Now, we're talking 15, 20 billion, right? For reference, the entire gross domestic product of the nation of Somalia annually is $12 billion.
I think he made a great point in this clip, which is that we as Americans opened up our arms. We opened up our home to the Somali refugees that came from there. And instead of being appreciative and assimilating into American society, working, doing everything that they could, what they did was they robbed us blind. I'm going to put something into perspective for you. Minnesotans paid about $15 billion in individual taxpayer money in 2024. If the fraud is up to $9 billion, that means that 60% of Minnesotans' taxpayer money funded this fraud. That also means that Minnesotans were paying for al-Shabaab to continue to destabilize Somalia. Now, here is the U.S. Attorney for Minnesota describing the scale of the fraud.
Minnesotans and taxpayers deserve to know the truth of the fraud. The fraud is not small. It isn't isolated. The magnitude cannot be overstated. What we see in Minnesota is not a handful of bad actors committing crimes. It's a staggering industrial-scale fraud.
Now, we all know that President Trump has been very vocal about the massive fraud that has occurred in Minnesota. And if you guys recall, Governor Walz was blasting President Trump for highlighting the fraud. But this is what the president had to say.
How about the new thing in Minnesota with the Somalians? They stole, now it came out, the great U.S. attorney up there, they came out, think of this, $9 billion, and they think that's just the beginning. They stole, think of it, in their country, they live on nothing, they have nothing. They come here and they steal $9 billion. Are we stupid? I mean, how do we allow that to happen? Ilhan Omar should be sent out of our country. She should not be allowed to be a congresswoman.
Now, listen, I believe if you are a U.S. citizen, whether you're naturalized or born here, you have every right to be a politician. And I believe that she has the right to be a politician. The issue that I have is the fact that she is integrated into that Somali community, but she denies that she had any understanding of the fraud that was happening. Make that make sense. Now, she recently came on CNN and stated that her son was pulled over because he was racially profiled. Let's listen here.
You've said that federal immigration agents actually pulled over your son on Saturday and asked him to prove his citizenship. He is, of course, a U.S. citizen, as are you. The Department of Homeland Security says, and I'm quoting them, ICE has absolutely zero record of its officers or agents pulling over Congresswoman Omar's son, and have accused you of seeking to, quote, demonize ICE as part of a PR stunt, their words. What do you say to that?
Well, if ICE is saying that they have documentation of every single person that they have pulled over in Minneapolis, we would love to see that record because we've certainly, myself and the governor, have been asking them to share information with us on the ways in which they have interacted with Minnesotans, and they have not been able to provide a single information. So it is amazing that they're able to put out this statement saying definitely that they did not pull my son over when they haven't been able to answer anything else.
I'm not buying anything that she said. I don't think her son was ever detained or stopped by ICE. I just don't believe it. Because if he would have, there'd be social media posts, there would be cameras, there would be something. Remember, there's a cell phone everywhere. Why didn't her son record what happened after? Why didn't he come out and say, listen, I just got pulled over by ICE. There they are. They're leaving right now. Probably because it never happened. Now, here's the ICE director contending what she said.
We checked with enforcement removal operations, Homeland Security investigations. We have zero evidence to say that we pulled that individual over. And, if we did, I would be out there explaining why we did the enforcement actions we do, which we constantly do all the time. But to just sit there and say that we did it and that it was racist and we're out there scaring and terrorizing the community, this is the type of political rhetoric that's leading to the 8,000% increase in death threats on my officers and agents, the over 1,500% increase in assaults and ramming of vehicles. It's these type of accusations is what's putting ICE in the crosshairs right now with these extremists.
Now, let me ask you a question. How often do you guys remember seeing Ilhan Omar coming on the news as much as she's coming on right now? Remember, she didn't like doing interviews. As a matter of fact, she stayed away from the media as much as she could. And now what she's trying to do is distract from the massive fraud that's happening in Minnesota. Do you guys see how good she is at deflecting from the original question? And the worst part about it is that the media usually just goes with the flow instead of pressing her on the original question. Do you remember when she was asked about the fraud in Minnesota initially? What did she do? She started saying, well, you have to understand that Somalis are victims too. How about the Minnesotans who lost 60% of the taxpayer money that they paid? But I guess she doesn't care about the majority of the Minnesotans and only cares about the Somali community at this point. Now, the governor claims that there are safeguards in place. Listen to this.
A couple of other things that are important about these services and the figures out there. So of the 18 billion, 6 billion ran through a managed care organization. So that's one level of vetting that they are charged with doing in their contracts with us. In addition, 10 billion of that 18 billion is subject to electronic visit verification. And that basically means that a worker that goes to provide services in someone's home is basically indicating with a timestamp when they arrived, when they left, what service they provided, who they are, and who received the service. So that's another level of vetting. The third is that $11 billion of the 18 was authorized by a county case manager. So that means that care was authorized according to clinical need, an assessment, a care plan, and then authorized again in the dollar amounts by a county case manager. So we are looking at all of those things to be sure that our checks and balances are working, certainly in partnership with those folks that are part of our systems. But I think that is just an important piece of context.
So you guys heard about all those safeguards that were in place. So exactly how did the fraud happen? It probably happened because a lot of the people that were in charge of overseeing those safeguards had a hand in the fraud as well. So now let's go ahead and move on to our next topic of the day, which is a hot button topic. HR 3492, which seeks to make it a federal crime for anybody to aid in any type of gender-affirming care for minors. Let's go ahead and listen from the author, Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Most Americans agree that kids just need to grow up before they do anything radical, like a mastectomy on a 15-year-old girl, castrate themselves through surgery, or even take dangerous drugs that have lifelong effects.
Now, before I go on, I want to make a point about the way that I feel about this whole situation about HR 3492. I think that people have the right to do whatever they want to their bodies. I think as grown-ups, as an adult, you should be able to decide what you do to your body, right? What you do with your body. The government should have absolutely no say in it. The issue that I have is when we allow our children to be mutilated. And I think the government should have a hand in prohibiting that, in not allowing that, especially if tax dollars are being used for that. But I also recognize that we as a society are very ignorant when it comes to understanding whether you're gay, whether you're lesbian, whether you're transgender. People think that if you're gay, that means that you're transgender. And I think not having a good understanding of that is what's allowing a lot of the bullying to take place that leads to emotional distress. Remember, we live in a country where 1 in 4 teens suffers from anxiety and depression. So let's look at some of the reaction from the Democrats.
Yeah, so-called limited government people suddenly want government to get in the way of the decisions that parents and their kids make together. Why do they want to stop children from getting medical care that has been proven to be safe and effective and helps them to live happily?
You know, I'm going to stop the video right there, and I'm going to throw some numbers at you because she's talking about transgender people living happily, right? Living happy. First of all, when it comes to Americans agreeing with gender-affirming care for minors, 60% of Americans, 2/3 of Americans, completely disagree with it. And the same number, 60%, disagree that taxpayer funds should be used for it. Only 15 to 25% of people who are gay or lesbian report being bullied in school or in the workplace. For transgender people, that number doubles. Now, this is the issue, and this is where the big argument lies, right? And this is where people butt heads. So when you talk about transitioning and people living happier after transition, that number doesn't change. People still report the same numbers when it comes to workplace harassment after transition. I think as a society, we need to do a better job of educating one another about gender dysphoria, about the emotional distress that comes with that, and what we can do as a society to ensure that these people are supported. I just don't agree with kids transitioning. Some of these kids don't even know what they want. I'll give you the example that I have of my son. When I was in the military, I was away constantly. So while I was deployed, my son stayed with my wife, my daughter, and my mother-in-law. During the time that he was with them, he developed some feminine tendencies, mannerisms, the way that he spoke, and there was nothing wrong with that. I understood that the reason he was like that was because he was with them. Now, what if he would have had a mom that said, you know what, let's embrace that. Let's embrace that part of you, that feminine side of you. Remember, kids are impressionable. And she would have said, let's go ahead and take you and get some gender-affirming care. That would have ruined his life forever. Because remember, if you are an influential parent, that means you're a good parent and kids will listen to you. And if you convince them that that is what's good for them just because they feel a certain way, then they're going to believe you. Remember, some of this gender-affirming care is irreversible. Let the kids grow up and decide for themselves what they want to do with their bodies. So let's take a look at what Dr. Oz had to say about the bill.
53% of children in America are in Medicaid or CHIP programs. So we provide insurance to most children, and commercial insurance follow us. But we are in a weird place in America where we have mixed politics and medicine. And you know what you get when you mix politics and medicine? Politics. There is no medicine left. We witnessed that with bizarre statements, predatory actions, and many other activities that I think have forced children to the tip of the spear where they have brunt the burden of this toxic combination.
I think Dr. Oz is exactly right. When we mix politics with medicine, we're left with politics. Unfortunately, I think the Democrats have hijacked this issue for simple political theater. Listen to this.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in strong opposition to H.R. 3492. This measure would allow politicians, not doctors, not families, in deciding medically necessary care for family members. It criminalizes medically necessary, evidence-based, life-saving care, and it threatens parents and physicians with prison time for providing care for their kids.
I think he's absolutely right. I think this H.R. 3492 would allow politicians to decide what type of care kids receive. But remember, the politicians are a reflection of the American public. And 60% of Americans believe that taxpayer dollars should not be paying for any type of gender-affirming care for minors. I think what we need to focus on is the psychological aspect. And I'm not saying send these kids to a counselor that's going to try to convince them to feel the complete opposite of what they feel. But instead, send them to somebody that's going to help them get through it. Somebody that's going to help them cope with the situation that they're in. Somebody who's going to make them mentally and emotionally stronger. I think that's what we need to focus on. And I think tax dollars should pay for that. Now, Dr. Oz goes on to talk about 3 major categories that people suffer under when it comes to politicized medicine. Listen to this.
Under politicized medicine, people suffer long-term consequences. Let me go through the 3 major categories. Puberty blockers, reduce bone density, alter brain development, which is a real problem when you're 11, 12, 13 years of age, and disrupt sexual function for the rest of your life, oftentimes. Cross-sex hormones cause irreversible changes, including infertility, loss of sexual function, even cardiovascular issues, as well as long-term endocrine problems. And of course, the surgical interventions where you remove healthy organs, despicable and reprehensible as it is, permanently alter appearances and destroy children's lives.
Now, I think one important thing that we need to note is the cost of these surgeries. I know you're going to have a lot of people on the left saying, well, this is minimal. It's just a couple of $100 million, not really a big deal. But some of these surgeries are ridiculous. The cost of some of these surgeries is astronomical.
And I'm just going to go through this grotesque laundry list of prices just so you're on the same page with what Secretary Kennedy started teasing at. According to a 2022 JAMA data, so it's very recent, the typical vaginoplasty, a procedure a child does not need, costs $60,000. Shockingly, a phalloplasty, the creation of a penis, costs, on average, in America, according to this data, high quality, $150,000 per child. I do believe, with doing some work, that these prices have continued to increase with increasing manufactured demand. And I must point out that the creation of a vagina, in that case of a phalloplasty, or a scrotoplasty where you add testicles, that's extra. This is a pathology that has afflicted the medical profession. It is shameful that clinicians have profiteered off this. I do not understand how it could possibly have been tolerated by the leadership of these institutions, but it will no longer be funded. And I can tell you, if they're so diehard desirous of helping children and they don't get paid, the question is, will they do these procedures? And I think we know the answer.
Now, remember earlier in the video, I told you that 60% of Americans do not agree with using tax dollars for gender-affirming care for minors. Here's Dr. Oz talking about the steps that they're taking to make sure that doesn't happen.
To reinforce the need to protect our children, we are announcing that certified Medicare and Medicaid hospitals, pretty much everyone in the hospital in the country, will no longer be permitted to perform certain sex-rejecting procedures on children. Any hospital that does offer sex-rejecting procedures to vulnerable populations of pediatric-age kids will no longer be able to participate in the Medicare and Medicaid program.
Look, I'll reiterate what I said earlier. H.R. 3492 passed the House. It's going to pass the Senate. Eventually, it's going to be made into law. The president's going to sign it. I think what we need to do as a community is make ourselves smarter when it comes to gay, lesbian, transgender, understanding the differences so that we can be more sensitive to the fact, be more sensitive to the issue, and be more compassionate and understanding of people who are transgender. All right, that wraps up the two stories. Make sure you guys give me your comments below. Tell me what you think about H.R. 3492, and tell me what you think about the Minnesota scandal, the Minnesota fraud, and if Ilhan Omar and Governor Walz should be taking more responsibility. Like, share, and subscribe, and until next time, stay balanced.